Good morning, my dear second graders. You can see I'm outside. The sun is shining. I'm right behind this beautiful forsythia here that has just budded these yellow little blossoms. So I will share with you the second part of the story I started yesterday. Francis carried in his heart the dream he had of walking through the halls and seeing the most magnificent tapestries and flags and weapons, all with the symbol of the cross on it. Francis tried to understand what his dream meant. And as he did that, in his hometown of Assisi, there was a battle about to start with a neighboring town called Apulia. Francis immediately put on his armor, for he was a courageous knight. He got on his horse and he galloped off to battle. But before Francis could reach the battle, he became so gravely ill. He could hardly walk. He had to lay down in a bed, for he had a high fever. Now he had a dream, and once again in his dream the same voice spoke to him. But the voice was questioning Francis, and the voice said, "Whom does it profit most to follow, the master or the servant?" Francis immediately answered, "The servant, Lord." "Then why do you leave the master and follow the servant?" Francis then spoke out and said, "Lord, what would you have me do then?" "Return to your country, and it will be told there." Well, Francis awoke with a cool brow. His fever had gone, and he was better. He put on his fine clothes, got back on his horse, turned his horse's head to his hometown of Assisi. And as he rode on his horse, he gazed with new eyes. And he saw with his new eyes beggars along the roadside. And for the first time his heart stirred with love for these people. For he had never noticed these beggars before. Well, he returned to Assisi, and his very wealthy friends were waiting for him. They immediately wanted him to join their lavish parties, and when Francis did, he didn't have the enjoyment or zest he had before. For Francis had lost the love of pleasure. For that love had faded, but something else in his heart was growing. And what was growing in his heart was the love for humankind. And this love flooded Francis with the most radiant light. Now, wherever Francis looked, he saw this love in people, and this love and pity increased in Francis day in and day out until Francis knew he had to go and help people in need. So first, second graders, he found those people that were the most poor. They had nothing, no possessions. And Francis was able to find food for them, and he cooked the food, and he cared for these very poor people. And next, Francis could see people that were so ill. They were covered in diseases, and no one wanted to go near them. But Francis, with great pity and love in his heart, would walk and sit beside these gravely ill people. he would speak out of his heart, and he would keep them company in their time of need when no one else would go near them. Well, Francis continued working in this way, serving other people and helping people. But there was one great feast that Francis decided to attend, and it was at the most exquisite home in his town of Assisi. He went there, and of course the table was laden with the most delicious food. There was great laughter, and Francis knew this was not his place anymore. For that love of enjoyment had faded, and so he left the table of great loud singing and jeering, and he went and found an open window. And he sat on that window and gazed up towards the twinkling stars. Now someone at the feast noticed that Francis had left the table, and they shouted after Francis, and they teased him, "Look at Francis, the stargazer!" And they laughed at him, and they said, "Do you see the face of your new wife in the heavens?" And Francis very calmly replied, "I see the face of love in heaven, and it is more beautiful than any one of you can imagine." Francis knew he no longer belonged at these feasts and parties, and he left while the people jeered and laughed at him. Francis knew he could not stay in Assisi, for he must venture elsewhere. Something urged him to ride a far distance to Rome, to St. Peter's Cathedral, the most magnificent church in all of Italy. He came to the stone steps, and there, leading up to this amazing cathedral, were throngs of poor people that were in need of something. St. Francis walked among them, now in the shadow of the great big dome. And he walked among them and went into the cathedral. And there he saw beautiful candles lit. And they were casting their light as if they were the stars twinkling in the sky. And Francis could see little offerings by these candles, and the offerings were meager, for the people who lit the candles were very poor. Well, Francis at that moment could feel the heavy purse he was carrying of gold coins, and impulsively he took the purse out and emptied the gold coins, leaving them at one of these offerings, these altars. Francis then returned back to the stone steps of St. Peter's Cathedral. And there he looked among the beggars and the poor, and he found a beggar. This beggar, his clothes, they were the most dirty and ripped and ragged. Well, Francis went to this beggar and he said, "Give me your clothes, brother, and in return I will give you my lavish silk robes to wear." The beggar immediately took off his dirty robes and willingly handed them to Francis. Francis put them on, and he stayed all day on the steps of St. Peter's. He stayed with the poor, and he watched people that were more fortunate walk by the street. And he could see those people. Some in their eyes had pity, and some of those people had scorn. But these people did not bother Francis. For Francis understood for the first time in his life what it meant to have poverty, to be poor. After that day, Francis returned back to Assisi. He was full of new life. Well, immediately he found the sweetest little church that was in ruin, and he went into the church and he fell on his knees, praying. And as he prayed, the voice in his dream returned to him. And the voice said, "Francis, can you not see that my church is in ruins? Go and restore it for me." "With good will," said Francis. "With good will, I will restore it." But Francis thought the voice spoke of this little sweet church called St. Damien, for Francis had not realized yet and understood that God's great church had no walls, had no ceiling. But Francis only saw the ruined church that he knelt in, and with urgency, he decided that he would restore this church. Where could he get money to do this? He thought. And immediately, Francis rushed home to his father's storerooms. There he took bulks of silk, the finest silk, and emptied all of his father's storerooms, Baradoni's storerooms. And he took this fine silk. He went to a close-by market. He sold every single bale of silk without his father's permission, and he received gold for it. Francis even sold the horse he rode in on, and with all of that gold he gathered it, and he went back to that sweet little church, St. Damien. He rushed up to the priest. His face was red, and he was panting, and he shouted, "Are you the priest of this sweet church?" The priest calmly answered, "Yes, son, I am the priest." "Then you must take this gold here." And he took all the gold out. "You must take this gold and you must restore your church to its glory." Well, the priest then said, "Where did this money come from, son?" And Francis lowered his head. "I sold my father's goods to get this gold." "But my dear son," said the priest, "the goods were not yours to sell." But Francis couldn't understand this. "Please, Father, take this gold. Take it. It will help you rebuild your church." "No," said the priest, "I cannot accept this." Francis was angry and he was discouraged. He flung the money into a corner. And the priest calmly said to Francis, "Go home and tell your father what you have done." "I dare not," murmured Francis. The puzzled priest then said, "I will let you stay here. I will give you shelter, but I cannot receive this money." And he took Francis in, leaving the gold in the dust.